Last weekend I was with family and walking with my 6-year-old niece. We stopped to look both ways before crossing the street, and she loudly exclaimed, "Looking both ways is boring." While she is probably right on that count, I reminded her how important it is to look both ways, so she doesn't stop doing it. But I wonder if she would have declared that sentence with such certainty if she played the 1981 arcade hit and globally popular amphibian death simulator, Frogger. I guess I'll have to share it with her someday. Frogger lives in a weird space of pop culture. I presume that everyone knows about the game. It's popular enough that NBC is making a reality game show around the concept. And as this tweet, which inspired the video you're watching, shows, some even consider it among the greatest video games ever made. But this frog has never managed to leap far from its earnest beginnings, has it? Sure, it's made its way into Seinfeld, and it has like 20 sequels, but none of them come close to being as memorable as the original arcade machine. Today, we're going to explore this prototypical traffic-dodging game, asking what makes it tick, and discussing the importance and meaning of high scores. Let's hop in. Frogger was developed by Konami and designed by Akira Hashimoto in 1981, who came up with the idea when he saw a frog trying to cross the road on his daily drive, but struggling because of all the traffic. Hashimoto, a man ostensibly with a heart of gold, picked up the frog and carried it to its destination, and inspiration struck, rewarding him for his altruism. Konami had a huge hit on their hands in Japan, but at the time didn't have much of an overseas presence, so they licensed the game to Sega Gremlin to manufacture worldwide. Still, Frogger may have never reached North American shores or global recognition without the aid of Elizabeth Falconer. Falconer was a market researcher for Gremlin who was asked by the company's founder to look through their portfolio and find any games worth licensing in North America. She found Frogger and took the game to Paramount, Sega's owners, to get it into American bars and arcades. The executives were incredibly dismissive of our wonderful little frog, telling Falconer that Frogger was a woman and kids game, expressing skepticism because another frog-themed game had failed a few years prior. While not all frog games are created equal, it appears that Paramount executives in 1981 didn't catch the memo. Falconer retorted to the assertion that the game wouldn't sell by positing that it was this very board of executives who had passed on Pac-Man just a year prior. Then the room went silent until an unnamed executive said, "Just let her have her kids' game." They set up a trial run at the small bar Spanky's Saloon in San Diego. The game proved to be massively popular there, despite the fact that the bar's patrons were nearly entirely men. Frogger would be published in North America on October 23, 1981, and the rest is history. Today, 40 years late, we salute you, Elizabeth Falconer, for making Frogger more than just big in Japan, for being the visionary we needed on that fateful summer day way back when. Though, I find the assertion from the Paramount executives that Frogger is a woman and kids game to be sadly relevant even now. You can see it all over. There are attempts to preserve gaming as a space for men at the exclusion of women. But what about Frogger is innately childish or womanish? Nothing. It's instead an absence of guns and explosions, of some masculine codified destructive urge that makes Frogger for one group and not for another. How dull. Its brilliant design doesn't matter, I guess, if some unnamed executive who has never played the game and only knows it stars a precarious croaker can decide in an instant who it's for and who it's not for. I'm glad Frogger's success proved those idiots wrong, but I wonder how much better the world of gaming would be if in the ensuing 40 years, those same attitudes didn't persist. Because it only takes about 1 minute with Frogger to realize it is impeccably designed. Like Pac-Man before it, the only player-executed verb is move, and the player must traverse a labyrinth of sorts in order to get to their goal. But unlike Pac-Man, the defining feature of Frogger is that the world is ambivalent to our amphibian protagonist. Cars and logs rush by without a thought for the little guy, and only the gators seem to even notice him, and are only interested in chomping him to bits. Thus, Frogger is a game about a cruel, uncaring world and escaping from it. There is no one frog in the game. Instead, the player is their guardian, the patron saint of frog traveling, if you will, guiding them through the maze, sometimes grabbing them a mate or a meal along the way. Once 5 frogs have reached their safe lily pads, the level resets, and the player receives 5 more frogs and lily pads, but a more difficult traffic task ahead of them. While there are minor changes between levels, the layout remains about the same. On the bottom half of the map, the player must avoid vehicles and cross the road. On the upper half of the map, the player must cross a river by jumping from one moving log or lily pad to another. The contrast between these two spaces is excellent. On the road, blank space is safety, that is, until a car crushes your frog's hopes and dreams. Frogs only move when they are commanded to, and anything else moving is danger on the road. On the upper half of the map, blank space is a danger, and it is only that which moves which is safe. Here, the frog moves along with the terrain, meaning the player now has to manage movement they can control with movement they can't. Frogger is always about the interplay between the player's frogs and their environment, requiring the player to plan ahead, analyzing each variable, and selecting a path that best protects the frogs from harm. Yet, the timer at the bottom of the screen, requiring the player to move quickly, provides that all-important tension in the game. Do this analytical task within the limits of time. I like to imagine this is because the frogs are drying out and need to get to the safety of the other side of the river in order to rehydrate. Though this headcanon is perhaps not the real canon. Regardless, just like frogs on real roads, Frogger is not just a game of thought and action, it is a game of death. Unlike Pac-Man or Mario Bros, there is no illusion here that you are playing as the same frog each time, since at a minimum there are 5 frogs to save per level. Instead, each frog is unique. You are giving it its one chance at life beyond this unfeeling hellscape. If you fail, the frog dies and that's it. And boy, are there a lot of ways to fail in Frogger. You can get crushed by a car, run into one, eaten by an alligator, fall into the river, which is evidently deadly for frogs, run into a wall, or get eaten by a snake. Frogger is a game about precariousness, and the many zany ways to die en route to one's lily pad reinforce the fragility of life. Most games in this era have few ways of failing, though you will probably fail a lot because they're arcade games, but not Frogger, a game which not only puts failure at the forefront of the player's experience, but gives them so many ways to fail that it is all but ensured. The beauty of Frogger is that all these deaths are intuitive. Each one begs the player to keep trying. It couldn't be that hard to avoid the car that hits you, or not get eaten by the alligator, but taken all together, these different fail states are the difficulty of the game, one that could go on forever with perfect play. But that's something no one has managed because death always looms above the green-skinned avatar. Only so many frogs can cross the road before some croak for the last time. The game's constant death brings us to my favorite thing about Frogger. Just how easy it is to second guess oneself while playing. Going backward is always an option, and traffic is always moving so quickly that the Frogger player is constantly questioning their decisions, trying to undo them the moment the going gets rough. But as anyone who has spent some time with the game will tell you, it's better to measure twice and move once than to measure once and move twice. A lot of my own deaths are from hastily making a decision then trying to undo it, only to be caught between a car and a hard place, flattened on the side of the road. Fortunately, at least some of these backtracks are successful, which gives Frogger a much different air about it than something like Pac-Man, where constant movement and progression is a necessity to avoid the ghosts that are hunting you. Instead, the frogs one commands can wait and consider before they bulldoze their way to or above death. Because each life matters so much, the player often finds themselves trying to make the best decisions and failing. The level does not react to them, only they can react to the level. But overreaction is its own curse, and one that must be kept in mind as one plays the game. Frogger has never escaped the gravity of this first game. Perhaps the developers, like the frogs they designed, spent too much time second-guessing what made the game great in the first place. Frogger is simple. It doesn't need more to be good. You can't add to it without fundamentally changing the puzzle. Some Frogger sequels tried to expand on the top-down perspective, but there isn't actually much more to do with that other than to make it overly complicated and sometimes dreadfully dizzy. There are 3 games that named Frogger 2, and none of them manage to leap far from their progenitor. They take the top-down leaping from one square to another in real time and try to expand on it, but none are particularly interesting. Others tried to jump genres like Mario, turning Frogger into a 2D or 3D platformer, but these don't look or feel like Frogger. This is because it seems like every designer after Frogger missed what made that game great in the first place, the precariousness of being a tiny thing in traffic. While that cannot be made more complex, games like Crossy Road show us that it can be made a bit simpler. Regardless, the danger of these worlds is that they are not made for frogs. It's the repetition, the need to continually take the same actions over and over in the face of changing circumstances that give Frogger its soul. It's the fact that the quest for safety is never done, that each moment of pressure to evade death grows until your frogs burst, all your lives gone. If we consider that arcade games are defined by failure, then Frogger is like an archetypical arcade game. It's almost a little out of place in any other context. A crucial element of this are the high scores that define the era, and that's where we're going to go next. In the season 9 episode of Seinfeld entitled The Frogger, Jerry and George return to their old high school haunt, Mario's Pizza Parlor, for a slice before it closes down for good. While there, they run into Drake from Drake and Josh and learn that George's high score of 860,630 is still the high score on the machine. And indeed, when the episode aired, this would have also topped the global Frogger charts. George's intractable problem is that with the pizzeria shutting down, so too will his high score be lost. Seeking to preserve the score, he buys the machine and hires a crew to help transport it, still on power so as not to erase the score, to a new and safe destination. Through a series of contrived events like most Seinfeld episodes, George must cross the street with the Frogger machine to keep his high score alive and fails, watching the game and his score burst to pieces. Frogger is an interesting game in terms of high scores. Most popular arcade games in the realm of high score competition have an ending. Pac-Man and Donkey Kong both have kill screens that halt play at a certain point, giving players an equal space of time to compete for a score. In Pac-Man, it is possible to achieve a perfect game where the player gets every point possible, and many players have achieved this. But Frogger cannot be played perfectly by humans. And while there are references to an integer overflow regarding Frogger on the internet, I can't find video or photo proof of a consistent kill screen. Instead, what we see in world record games is people ultimately succumbing to the fateful force of death herself. You can only go so long, only cross so many roads, only lead so many frogs to safety before your watch is ended by the swift sight of despair. In theory, a perfect player could play Frogger forever, or at least until they hit the fabled integer overflow, but that player doesn't exist. What does exist is all of us mortals, like George Costanza pushing the Frogger machine across the street, attempting our best to make do with the frogs we have. And this is the beauty of high scores. They give us an opportunity to compare our burgeoning amphibian philanthropy and gaming skills against one another. They also suggest to the player the best or supposedly most fun way to play the game by introducing optional tasks to gain more points. In Frogger, this isn't picking up potential mates as female frogs on your way and selecting the lily pad with a fly waiting to be gobbled up. When the score comes into play, Frogger becomes not just a game about getting across the road, but getting across it in the right way, presuming that an arbitrary number higher than your friends is important to you. First and foremost, high scores serve a social function, which is why their list form on classic arcade machines is so important. They mark that someone was here, playing this game in the past, and that you, playing on that machine today, are competing against their ghost. High scores create a temporal and spiritual link between players of the same game, that even though they cannot compete directly against one another like in a traditional multiplayer game, they are still together. They tell others about us while giving a sense of them through numerical translation. This is why George was so hell-bent on preserving his high score. He wanted to keep that memory going, not just keep his victory, but some aspect of his old social self alive. Stave off aging, stave off death for just a bit longer. Even after you die, your social identity hangs around those who love you. Your absence leaves a space that can't be filled, and your high scores on an old machine persist. Because while a round of a single-player arcade game is a singular experience, and we are people with singular identities, we are also social people living a public existence, and an arcade machine is a social game with a public life. Such public life has changed since Frogger's release, though. Sure, in 1982, you might have found global high scores in a magazine or called up to get them, but your competition was always local, always the other Frogger fan in the bar. Knowledge was passed slowly, if at all, about the game. This makes the arcade machine like a relic, a sword in the stone that any player can try their luck at and maybe come out on top. Yet, in the contemporary age, we have a much more robust competition, a worldwide one, whether that's speedrunning or high score chasing or esports. You can watch YouTube videos on how to do it better, see the best runs, know there's always someone out there better than you, and just how inaccessible being the best actually is. Safe to say, you cease competing against friends and start competing against everyone. And I think the culture of gaming gains a lot from this shift, but it also loses the mystique of the local arcade in the process. Kind of like going from a local baseball game with your coworkers to Major League Baseball. The game is more developed, more beautiful, but less personal. Don't get me wrong though, I don't think we can or should go back to that older time. But it is a death worth remarking upon and contemplating. A death that inspired a great episode of a television series. A death brought about by age and change, as all death is. The kind of death Frogger is well suited to comment on, because every Frogger game ends in death, and every high score attempt manages to keep death at bay, if only for a little longer.